It was a day like any other, a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day meant for family time and relaxation. The air was crisp but not too cold, with the early fall leaves just beginning to turn. I remember the sun shining through the trees as we walked through the park, my wife, Emily, beside me, and our two kids running ahead, chasing each other along the paths. It was one of those moments where everything seemed to slow down, and I couldn't help but feel grateful for the life we had built together. Emily was in a good mood that day, laughing easily, her arm looped through mine as we strolled. We were talking about mundane things, plans for the week, what to make for dinner, when something changed. As we walked past the lake, a man approached from the opposite direction, his head down, fiddling with his phone as he walked. The moment Emily spotted him, everything about her shifted. She stiffened beside me, her hand slipping from my arm, and her face turned pale. For a second, I thought she had seen something alarming, something dangerous. I followed her gaze, expecting to see a stray dog or a group of unruly teenagers. But no, it was just a man, casually walking past us. I didn't recognize him at first. There was nothing particularly remarkable about him. Average height, brown hair, dressed in a simple jacket. But when he looked up and his eyes met Emily's, something flickered between them. It was so quick, so subtle, that I almost missed it. A brief, startled exchange, like they hadn't expected to see each other. The man's face tightened for a moment before he nodded, offering a small smile, and then walked on. Emily, however, blushed, visibly. Her cheeks flushed a deep red, and she looked away, pretending to fix her hair. "Who was that?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my heart was already beating faster. She laughed, but it was a forced sound, her eyes still avoiding mine. "Oh, no one," she said quickly, her voice a little too light. "I don't know. Probably someone I've seen around." I stared at her for a moment, puzzled. Emily wasn't the type to get flustered around strangers, and the way she had reacted, something wasn't right. "Are you sure?" I pressed gently. "You looked like you knew him." She waved her hand dismissively, her laugh a bit more natural this time. "I think you're reading into it too much, babe. I don't know him. Let's catch up with the kids." But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than she was letting on. I didn't push, though. We continued our walk, her arm slipping back through mine. But something had shifted. The rest of the afternoon passed like a blur, and even though Emily returned to her usual cheerful self, that moment stuck with me. The look on her face, the way she had blushed. It wasn't nothing, but I told myself to let it go. Maybe I was being paranoid. Over the next few days, life went back to normal. Or at least it seemed like it had. Emily didn't mention the man again, and I tried my best to push the incident out of my mind. Work was busy, the kids were keeping us on our toes, and I figured maybe I had been overthinking it. But every now and then, when I'd catch Emily glancing at her phone a little too quickly or see her lost in thought, I'd feel that nagging doubt creep back in. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. It was a Thursday, and I had left work early to pick up some groceries. As I pulled into the supermarket parking lot, I spotted Emily's car, parked in the far corner, away from the store's entrance. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe she had decided to run some errands, or maybe she was meeting a friend for coffee. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the passenger seat of her car was the man from the park. I froze, gripping the steering wheel, my heart hammering in my chest. They hadn't seen me yet, but it was clear they were talking. No, not just talking. There was something about the way they were sitting, the way Emily was leaning toward him, her hand resting on his arm. It wasn't casual. It wasn't innocent. For a moment, I couldn't move. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. Was this why she had been acting strange? Was this the reason for the blush in the park? Had there been something going on all this time, and I had been too blind to see it? I could feel the anger rising inside me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't confront them. Not yet. I needed to know more. If I stormed over there and demanded answers, I'd never get the truth. Emily was good at talking her way out of things. Too good. No, I had to be smart about this. So I pulled into a space a few rows away, making sure they couldn't see me. I watched as they talked, as the man reached out to touch Emily's hand. She didn't pull away. If anything, she leaned in closer. My stomach churned with a sickening mix of jealousy and rage. After what felt like an eternity, they finally parted ways. The man got out of the car, glanced around the parking lot, and walked off toward another vehicle. I waited until he was gone before I pulled out of the lot, careful to stay out of sight. That night, I didn't say anything to Emily. I acted like everything was normal, but inside, I was seething. I needed to know more before I confronted her. I needed proof. For the next few days, I kept a close eye on Emily. I didn't want her to know I was suspicious, so I pretended to be my usual self. But I started paying more attention to the small things. The way she checked her phone more frequently, the sudden, unexplained errands she had to run, the moments when she seemed distant, lost in thought. I followed her a couple of times, keeping my distance, watching from afar as she met with the man in parking lots or out-of-the-way spots. Each time, they seemed careful, like they didn't want to be seen together, but there was no mistaking the intimacy between them. The way they smiled at each other, the way they touched, it was obvious. Something was happening between them, and it wasn't just friendship. But still, I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed to catch them red-handed. I needed to make sure there was no way she could deny it. Then, one evening, I saw my chance. I had come home earlier than usual, hoping to surprise Emily. But when I walked in, the house was quiet, too quiet. The kids were at their grandparents' house for the weekend, and I had expected Emily to be home, maybe watching TV or reading a book. But she wasn't there. Her car was gone. My heart raced as I checked my phone. No missed calls, no messages. She hadn't mentioned going anywhere. I glanced at the clock, 7:30. Where could she be at this time of night? Without thinking, I grabbed my keys and headed out the door. There was only one place she could be. I drove to the parking lot I had seen them meet at before, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I parked at the edge of the lot, staying hidden in the shadows, and waited. It didn't take long. There they were, sitting in Emily's car, just like before. But this time, something was different. The air between them felt more charged, more urgent. They were talking, their heads close together, and then, to my horror, I saw it. He leaned in, and she didn't pull away. They kissed. It wasn't just a quick, stolen kiss like before. This was different. This was real. I felt my stomach drop, the world around me spinning. It was one thing to suspect it, to think that maybe something was going on, but seeing it with my own eyes, watching the woman I loved kissing another man, it was too much. I wanted to storm over there, to yank open the car door and drag him out, to scream at her for betraying me. But I held back. If I did that now, I'd never get the full truth. No, I needed to know everything. I needed to confront her when she had no way to lie, no way to hide behind half-truths and excuses. So I waited. Later that night, when Emily came home, I was sitting at the kitchen table, waiting for her. She looked surprised to see me, her smile a little too forced. "Hey," she said, setting her keys down on the counter. "You're home early." "Yeah," I replied, my voice tight. "Where were you?" She hesitated, just for a moment, but it was enough. "Oh, I was just out running some errands." "Errands," I repeated, my eyes locked on hers. "At 7:30 at night?" She shifted uncomfortably, her fingers toying with the strap of her purse. "Yeah, I had to pick up a few things." I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor as I did. "Don't lie to me, Emily." Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw real fear in them. "What are you talking about?" I took a step toward her, my voice low but steady. "I saw you. I saw you with him." The color drained from her face, her hand flying to her mouth. "Brian, Don't," I interrupted, my voice shaking with barely contained rage. "Don't lie to me again. I saw you. I followed you. I've been watching you for days." She stared at me, her eyes filling with tears, but she didn't say anything. She didn't deny it. And that was all the confirmation I needed. "How long has it been going on?" I demanded, my voice rising. "How long, Emily?" "It's not what you think," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I swear, it wasn't supposed to happen. Tonight was the first time." "Don't lie to me," I shouted, my anger boiling over. I saw you. I saw everything, she sobbed, her shoulders shaking as she collapsed into the nearest chair. It was just, I don't know how it happened. We were just talking, and then, I don't know. I don't know. I stared at her, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing. How could this have happened? How could the woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted, do this to me? It's over, I said finally, my voice hollow. I can't do this anymore. Emily looked up at me, her eyes wide with panic. Brian, please. But I didn't wait to hear the rest. I turned and walked out the door, leaving her sobbing at the kitchen table. The next few days were a blur. I stayed at a hotel, avoiding calls from Emily and trying to wrap my head around what had happened. I had thought we were happy. I had thought we were solid. But clearly, I had been wrong. When I finally returned home, it was to pack my things. Emily was there, waiting for me, her face pale and tear-streaked. She tried to talk to me, to explain, but I wasn't ready to hear it. Not yet. I told her I needed space, time to think, and as I drove away, the weight of her betrayal settled over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable. What had once been a simple walk in the park had turned into the unraveling of everything I thought I knew. And now, I was left with nothing but the pieces of a broken marriage. Over the next few days, I stayed in a haze of shock, anger, and confusion. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Emily and that man. His face a blur of smug arrogance, and hers, the face of the woman I loved, betraying everything we had built. The pain was fresh and raw, like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. But amidst the pain, something kept gnawing at me, a sense that I still didn't have the full picture. I had caught them in the car, and Emily had admitted that they kissed, but she claimed that night was the first time anything physical had happened. My gut told me otherwise. How many times had she lied to my face, saying everything was fine? How many unexplained errands had she run, with me sitting at home, oblivious? It wasn't just the affair that haunted me. It was the thought that I didn't know how deep the betrayal ran. A few days later, I made a decision. If Emily wasn't going to tell me the truth, I'd have to find it myself. I went through her phone. It was something I had never done before, and it felt wrong. But at this point, I needed answers. I couldn't take her word for it anymore. I couldn't take the half-truths and the vague apologies. The first thing I noticed was that the man she had been seeing was saved in her contacts under a generic name, Mike. Not suspicious on the surface, but it became clear she'd been covering her tracks. Most of the recent messages had been deleted, but she hadn't covered everything. There were still gaps in her cleanup, and within those gaps, I found what I was looking for. I scrolled back through old texts between them, finding the ones that hadn't been erased. It wasn't just casual conversation or a one-time slip-up. The messages were intimate, playful, and full of inside jokes. He had sent her pictures, selfies, nothing explicit, but enough to show that this wasn't just some spur-of-the-moment fling. There had been lunch meetings, innocent coffee dates, and an entire string of conversations about trying to find time when they could be alone together. My blood boiled as I read the texts. There was one, in particular, that made me feel like the air had been sucked from the room. Can't wait for next weekend, Em. Finally, some real time together. We deserve this. Next weekend. Real time together. I stared at the date of the message, and my stomach turned. It was sent 2 weeks ago, the weekend I had been out of town for a work conference. Emily had told me she was going to spend the weekend relaxing at home, catching up on her favorite shows, and maybe visiting her sister. I felt sick. I threw the phone onto the couch, my mind racing. So that night I had caught them in the car wasn't their first time. It wasn't even close. They had been planning to spend an entire weekend together, under my nose, while I was away. And from the sound of it, they had been waiting for the right opportunity to sleep together. I couldn't breathe. Everything I thought I had known, everything Emily had told me, was a lie. The next few days were hell. I avoided Emily, staying out late and sleeping on the couch. When I did see her, I barely spoke. I couldn't bear to look at her, knowing what I knew now. She kept trying to reach out, kept saying we needed to talk, but I wasn't ready to confront her. I wasn't ready to admit how far gone our marriage was. But I couldn't avoid her forever. I had to confront her. I had to know the truth. No more lies, no more half-truths. That Friday night, I told Emily we needed to talk. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her eyes puffy from crying, her hands twisting in her lap. I took a deep breath, trying to control the anger simmering just beneath the surface. "I know you've been lying to me," I said quietly, watching her closely. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I saw panic flash across her face. "Brian, Don't," I interrupted. "Don't start with the excuses. I've seen the texts, Emily. I know about the weekend you spent together while I was out of town." She looked like I had slapped her. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The silence hung between us, thick and oppressive. "I just want the truth," I said, my voice shaking. "I want to know how long this has been going on. I want to know why." Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she covered her face with her hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice muffled. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry doesn't answer my questions," I said coldly. "How long?" She wiped at her eyes, struggling to compose herself. "It's been a few months," she admitted finally, her voice barely audible. "It started after that fight we had. You remember? When you were so busy with work, and I felt like you weren't even there anymore." "Don't you dare blame this on me," I snapped, my anger boiling over. "Don't you dare try to justify what you've done." She flinched, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she said through her tears. "I never meant for it to go this far. It just did." "How far?" I asked, my voice cold. "Have you slept with him?" She hesitated for a moment too long. "Emily," I barked, slamming my hand down on the table. "Have you slept with him?" Her face crumpled, and she nodded, unable to speak. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. "How many times?" I demanded, my voice a dangerous whisper. "I don't know," she sobbed. "I don't know. A few times. It wasn't serious, Brian, I swear. It wasn't about love." I stared at her, the woman I had built a life with, the mother of my children, and I felt nothing but disgust. "You've destroyed everything," I said quietly, my voice trembling. "Do you understand that?" She nodded, her face wet with tears. "I know," she whispered. "I know, and I'm sorry. I'll do anything to fix this. Please, Brian, we can fix this." But I wasn't so sure. How do you fix something when the trust is gone? How do you rebuild after someone has shattered everything? I thought that would be the end of it, that Emily's confession would be the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. But there was one last twist in the story, one last revelation that would turn everything upside down. A week after our confrontation, I received an anonymous message. It was late at night, and I was lying on the couch, trying to make sense of the mess my life had become, when my phone buzzed. The message was short, just a few words, but it sent a chill down my spine. "You don't know the whole story. Check her phone." At first, I thought it was a prank, some cruel joke from someone who had heard about the affair. But something in my gut told me to listen. So I waited until Emily was in the shower the next morning, then I took her phone and scrolled through her messages. I found it quickly, an unknown number with a string of recent texts. They were explicit, far more graphic than the ones I had seen before, and they made my stomach turn. But it wasn't just the messages that shocked me. It was the photos. There were pictures of Emily, nude, posed provocatively, sent to someone I didn't recognize. Pictures that I had never seen. Pictures she had never sent to me. And then I saw it. A message from the unknown number, sent just a few days before. "I can't wait until our next night together. Your husband will never find out." The message was dated after I had caught her with the man in the car. This wasn't over. Emily hadn't stopped the affair. She had just gotten better at hiding it. I confronted her again that night, my voice shaking with rage. "You told me it was over," I said, holding up her phone. "You swore to me that it was over." Too. She looked at the screen, her face draining of color, and for a moment, I thought she was going to faint. "Brian, I can explain." "Explain?" I shouted, throwing the phone onto the table. "Explain what?" "How you've been sneaking around behind my back even after I caught you. How you're still seeing him." She broke down, collapsing onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm sorry," she cried. "I didn't know how to stop. I wanted to, but I couldn't. Please, Brian, I'm so sorry." But her apologies meant nothing to me now. The trust was gone. The marriage was over. "I'm filing for divorce," I said quietly, my voice hollow. "This is done." And with those words, I walked out the door, leaving her sobbing on the floor. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, meetings with lawyers, and trying to explain to the kids why their mom and dad weren't living together anymore. Emily tried to reach out, tried to apologize, but I couldn't hear it anymore. I couldn't forgive her. The betrayal was too deep, too raw. She had destroyed everything we had built, and now I was left to pick up the pieces. The months that followed the confrontation felt like I was walking through the wreckage of a life I no longer recognized. I had left our home behind, that place once filled with laughter and warmth, now nothing more than a shell of broken promises. The kids were confused, hurt by the sudden absence of their dad at the dinner table, but I did my best to explain things in ways their young minds could grasp. "Mommy and Daddy just need some time apart," I had told them. Simple words to cover up a much more complicated truth. Emily, on the other hand, was unraveling. She sent me messages daily, begging for forgiveness, for just one more chance. In every text, every tear-filled voicemail, she tried to explain, tried to rationalize the affair as if there was some way to make sense of it. But all I saw was the woman who had lied, not just to me but to herself too. She wasn't sorry she had done it. She was sorry she had been caught. I couldn't go back. There was no repairing this. But what I didn't expect was how hard it would be to rebuild my own life. Every corner of that empty apartment echoed with the absence of my kids, the hollow sound of a once busy home now replaced by silence. I had lost my family, and while the anger I felt toward Emily still burned, the loneliness crept in like a fog, suffocating. One evening, a few weeks after I had moved out, I received an email that threw everything into chaos again. It was from an address I didn't recognize. My first instinct was to ignore it. Spam, I thought, but something about the subject line stopped me cold. "You need to know the full truth." My heart pounded as I opened the message, my fingers trembling. The email was short, just a few sentences, but every word sent a chill down my spine. "Brian, you think you've caught everything, but you haven't. The man your wife was seeing isn't who you think he is. If you want the truth, meet me tomorrow at 3 p.m. near the lake in Willow Park. This goes deeper than you know." There was no name, no signature, nothing to identify the sender. It was unsettling, cryptic, and yet it felt real. Was this some sick joke, or was there something I had missed? My mind raced. I had already caught Emily, already uncovered her lies. What more could there possibly be? But the way things had unfolded so far, the random encounters, the secret texts, it made me question everything I thought I knew. The next day, I couldn't shake the sense of dread that followed me as I headed to Willow Park. The location was significant. It was the same park where this whole nightmare had started, where we had seen the man for the first time, and Emily had blushed in a way that still haunted me. I didn't want to go, didn't want to open any more doors that led to painful revelations, but something in me needed closure. I needed to know the full extent of the betrayal. When I arrived at the lake, the wind had picked up, sending ripples across the water. The park was mostly empty, save for a few joggers and dog walkers in the distance. I waited near the bench, glancing around anxiously, wondering who would show up. And then, I saw him. It wasn't the mysterious sender of the email. It was the man from the car, the one who had kissed Emily. Mike, or whatever his real name was. He approached slowly, his face unreadable. My gut twisted as he walked toward me. What the hell was he doing here? "Brian," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. He looked different from the smug, confident man I had seen before. There was no arrogance in his eyes now, only something that resembled regret. "We need to talk." "Talk?" I spat, my fists clenching at my sides. "You've done enough talking, haven't you? What the hell are you doing here?" He raised his hands, taking a step back. "I know you hate me, and you have every right to. But before you do anything, you need to know the truth about what's been going on. What more is there to know?" I snapped, my voice trembling with anger. You've been seeing my wife. You've been sneaking around behind my back. I already know everything I need to." He shook his head, looking down at the ground. "No, you don't," he said softly. "It's not just about Emily. There's something else you don't know." The weight of his words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I stared at him, my mind racing. What could he possibly be talking about? What more could there be? "Spit it out," I demanded, my heart pounding in my chest. He took a deep breath, his face pale. "I wasn't just seeing Emily. I was paid to meet her, to start something with her." For a moment, I didn't understand. His words didn't make sense. Paid? What the hell was he talking about? But then, like a puzzle piece snapping into place, the realization hit me, and I felt the blood drain from my face. "You were paid?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "Paid by who?" Mike hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the ground again. "Her boss," he said quietly. "He wanted leverage over her, some way to control her, to keep her under his thumb at work. He thought if she was distracted, wrapped up in this affair, she'd be easier to manipulate. I was supposed to get close to her, and then use it against her." I stumbled back, the world spinning around me. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. "You're lying," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Why should I believe you?" "I'm not lying," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "Look, I don't expect you to believe me. Hell, I didn't want to do it in the first place, but I needed the money. And then I got in too deep. It wasn't supposed to go this far. I was just supposed to get close to her, make her vulnerable. But things, they got out of control. She started having real feelings, and I couldn't hear anymore. My mind was spinning with 1,000 questions. Her boss? Emily's boss? What kind of sick game had he been playing? And Emily, had she known? Did she have any idea she had been manipulated, played like a pawn in someone else's twisted scheme? "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Because I couldn't live with it anymore," Mike said, his voice breaking. "I screwed up, Brian. I thought I could walk away after it was over, but I can't. Emily, she didn't deserve this, and neither did you." The rage that had been simmering inside me now exploded into something else entirely, a cold, calculated anger. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. This was about power, manipulation, and control. And now, I had a target, Emily's boss. I turned away from Mike, my mind racing with what I needed to do next. "Brian, I'm sorry," he called after me, "for everything," but I didn't respond. I was done with him. There was someone else I needed to deal with now. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying Mike's words over and over in my mind. I didn't know what to believe. Could it really be true? Could Emily's boss have orchestrated the whole thing, using her for his own twisted gain? I thought about all the late nights Emily had spent at work, the stress she had been under for the past year. She had mentioned her boss a few times. Nothing major, just complaints about how demanding he was, how he made unreasonable requests. But never anything like this. I felt sick to my stomach. The next day, I called my lawyer. "I want to go after him," I said, my voice steely with determination. "Her boss. He's been manipulating my wife, using her." The lawyer was quiet for a moment before responding. "Brian, this is a complicated situation. You'd need proof. Without evidence, it's your word against his." Proof. I needed proof. But how could I get it? I spent the next few weeks in a haze, trying to piece together a plan. I needed to find a way to expose Emily's boss for what he had done, to show the world that he had manipulated my wife, used her as a pawn in his sick game. But without evidence, I was stuck. Emily, in the meantime, had no idea what was going on. I hadn't confronted her about what Mike had told me. Part of me didn't even know if I should. Would she believe me? Or had she been so deep in this mess that she wouldn't want to face the truth? One evening, as I sat in my apartment, a new idea started to form. If Emily's boss really was behind this, there had to be a trail. Emails, messages, something that would show his involvement. And if Emily still worked for him, maybe I could find it. But that meant getting access to her phone, her computer. It meant confronting her again, digging deeper than I had before. It meant opening up old wounds, knowing that whatever I found could make things worse. When I finally met with Emily again, I was calm, too calm. She sensed something was off, but I didn't let her know what I had learned. Instead, I played the role of the weary husband, a man worn down by betrayal but ready to talk. As we sat down, I looked her in the eyes and said, "There's something I need to know, and I need you to be honest with me. Has anyone at your job ever made you feel uncomfortable? Has anyone ever used your personal life against you?" She frowned, clearly confused. "What do you mean?" I hesitated, trying to find the right words. "Your boss, has he ever done anything that made you feel like he had power over you? Something beyond just work?" Her face paled, and that's when I knew. That's when I saw the fear creep into her eyes. "Brian, why are you asking me this?" Her voice wavered, and she clutched her hands in her lap, her knuckles white. "Did someone tell you something?" "I need to know, Emily," I pressed, leaning forward. "Did your boss pressure you into this? Into anything?" She looked down at her hands, silent for what felt like an eternity. And then, finally, she spoke. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But I didn't want to admit it. I thought I could handle it, that it would go away if I just ignored it. But I couldn't. I felt a surge of anger rise in me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed the full story. "What did he do?" I asked, my voice trembling. Emily wiped at her eyes, taking a deep breath. "He knew things about our marriage, about us. He made comments, little digs, about how happy I seemed. And then he started suggesting things. At first, it was small, flirting, implying I owed him. And then, one day, he introduced me to Mike. He said Mike would be good company while you were busy with work." I clenched my fists, trying to keep the rage from boiling over. "I didn't know what to do," she continued, her voice breaking. "I thought I could just ignore it, but it spiraled. And I'm sorry, Brian. I'm so sorry. I never wanted this." I stood up, pacing the room, my mind racing. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. This was about power, control, manipulation. Emily had been used, and I had been blindsided. But now, I knew the truth, and I was going to make sure the man behind it all paid. I walked out of that room feeling like the ground beneath me had cracked open, and I was free falling into a pit of anger and confusion. Emily's admission, her boss's twisted role in all of this, had thrown everything into a new light. It was no longer just an affair. It was something much darker, more insidious. My wife had been manipulated, used, and I had been blind to it all. But now, I wasn't going to let it slide. I got in my car and sat there for a long time, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Emily's tearful apology echoed in my mind, but it didn't matter. She had been wrong to give in to whatever pressure her boss had applied, but the real villain here was the man pulling the strings. He had preyed on her insecurities, taken advantage of her, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I pulled out my phone and dialed my lawyer. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steely. The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings and consultations. My lawyer warned me that going after Emily's boss wasn't going to be easy. He was a powerful man, well-connected in his field, and taking him down would require more than just hearsay. We needed hard evidence, something that could prove not only that he had manipulated Emily, but that he had done it systematically, using his position of power to exploit her and possibly others. I knew it was a long shot, but I didn't care. I wanted justice, not just for me but for Emily too, in a strange way. As much as she had hurt me, I couldn't ignore the fact that she had been a pawn in someone else's game, and that someone needed to pay. We started by digging into his background, looking for any signs of past complaints, any rumors of inappropriate behavior in the workplace. But, as expected, everything seemed clean on the surface. He had a spotless reputation, a man who had built his career on charm and charisma. But I knew that charm was a mask. Beneath it, he was a predator. The turning point came when we tracked down one of Emily's former coworkers. Her name was Sarah, and she had worked under the same boss a few years ago before abruptly leaving the company. My lawyer reached out to her discreetly, and after some convincing, she agreed to meet with us. When I sat across from Sarah in a small cafe on the other side of town, I could see the hesitation in her eyes. She was nervous, constantly glancing around as if she expected someone to recognize her. But when she started talking, it was like a dam had broken. "I didn't leave that company by choice," she said, her voice shaking. "I was forced out, and it was because of him." My heart raced as she spoke, recounting how Emily's boss had targeted her in much the same way. The compliments, the small advances, the gradual escalation of his behavior. At first, she thought it was harmless, just office banter. But then he started making demands, asking her to stay late, to join him for drinks after work. And when she tried to pull away, to create distance, the threats began. He told me that if I didn't play along, I'd be blacklisted. He said no one in the industry would hire me if I didn't keep him happy, Sarah said, tears welling in her eyes. I didn't know what to do. I was young, desperate to keep my job. But after a while, I couldn't take it anymore. I quit, and I've been trying to forget it ever since. I felt sick as she spoke, the similarities between her story and Emily's striking. This wasn't a one-off situation. This man had been doing this for years, preying on women who worked for him, manipulating them into impossible situations. And now, I had the proof I needed. Sarah agreed to give a statement, though she was terrified of the repercussions. She had moved on from that life, built a new career, but she couldn't stand by and watch him do the same thing to someone else. With her testimony and the texts and emails we had gathered, we finally had enough to take action. The lawsuit we filed wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about exposing a pattern of behavior, about shining a light on a man who had been abusing his power for years. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves through the industry. Suddenly, other women began coming forward. Women who had worked for him, women who had experienced the same harassment, the same manipulation. The media picked up the story, and soon his pristine reputation began to crumble. He denied everything, of course, claiming that the accusations were part of a smear campaign, that he was being targeted unfairly. But the evidence was mounting. His carefully crafted image was falling apart, and no amount of PR could save him now. Emily was devastated when she found out that her boss was being investigated. I hadn't told her about the lawsuit right away. I wanted to gather as much information as possible before bringing her into it. But once the case became public, there was no avoiding it. She came to me, her face pale and tear-streaked, asking how I could do this, how I could drag her personal life into the spotlight, how I could make everything worse. "I did it for you," I said quietly, "because you deserve to know that none of this was your fault. You were manipulated, Emily. You were used, and he needs to pay for what he's done." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and sorrow. "But I cheated on you, Brian. I ruined our marriage. How can you still?" "You made mistakes," I interrupted, my voice steady. "But you were put in an impossible situation. That doesn't excuse what you did, but it explains a lot. And this is bigger than us. He's hurt so many people. He needs to be stopped." Emily broke down then, sobbing into her hands as the weight of everything finally hit her. We sat in silence for a long time, the air between us heavy with years of hurt and regret. In the months that followed, the lawsuit progressed, and the case against Emily's boss grew stronger. More and more women came forward, adding their voices to the chorus of those who had been silenced for too long. The company tried to distance itself from him, but it was too late. He had become a liability, and eventually, they cut ties with him completely. Emily quit her job, unable to stay in a place that had become so toxic. She was still processing everything, still coming to terms with the fact that she had been manipulated, that she had been part of something far darker than she had ever imagined. We spoke occasionally, mostly about the kids, but there was an unspoken understanding between us that things would never go back to the way they were. As for me, I moved forward with my life. The anger I had once felt, the rage that had consumed me, slowly began to fade. It didn't happen all at once, but over time, I started to find peace. I started to rebuild. The betrayal still hurt, and there were days when I found myself thinking about what might have been, what our marriage could have looked like if things had been different. But I knew now that clinging to the past wouldn't help me heal. Years later, the storm had finally passed. Emily and I remained amicable, co-parenting our children and doing our best to create a stable environment for them. She had remarried, finding someone who, from what I could tell, treated her well. And I found peace in the quiet moments, in the new life I had built for myself. The lawsuit had brought some measure of justice, though nothing could ever undo the damage that had been done. The man who had manipulated Emily, and so many others, was exposed for what he was. His career was over, his reputation in ruins, and for the first time, I felt like there was closure. But more than that, I had learned something invaluable through the ordeal. I had learned that forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation. I had learned that healing takes time, and sometimes, the person you need to forgive most is yourself. Emily and I would never be what we once were, but I had made peace with that. We were both different people now, shaped by the choices we had made and the lessons we had learned. And as I stood on the porch of my new home, watching the sun set over the horizon, I realized that I had finally let go of the past. The anger, the betrayal, it no longer held power over me. I had survived, and in the end, that was all that mattered. And that's how it ended. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment your thoughts below. Tell us, what would you have done in their shoes?